having me today. I'm the director of a documentary released last year called The Donut King. Thank you for having me on your show.
That was a very brief introduction, Alice. Thank you. Welcome to be on the Better Than Peter podcast. I'm very excited. We reached out to you on Instagram to use the cliche. We slid in your DMs. You were very responsive, and thank you for making time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for finding the film. I understand you're on the other side of the world from where I am.
Yeah, I mean, we got it on Amazon Prime. So I actually wanted to ask this question later, but tell me, I mean, we can dive right into it. I mean, did not having a traditional theatrical run, assuming the world was not having COVID, would this movie released all over in cinemas as we know it, or was that not the plan?
It's every filmmaker's dream, right? To have the film released in cinemas. It's why we get romanticized by movies in the very beginning. And when COVID hit, we had no idea. We thought it might be a couple months. We thought everything would be back to be normal by the summer. And our distributor, Greenwich Entertainment in North America here, they are a wonderful theatrical distributor. And we were really excited. I said, oh my God, I can't believe my first movie is going to get theatrical release. Okay. But it was virtual cinema, which is a term that virtually nobody understands unless you work in the business. But virtual cinema is just another word for streaming. So if you have a local movie theater, people who are in the US would be familiar with like AMC or art house theaters like Laemmle or the Angelica in New York. We sold the film through them. So you would go to their website, buy a virtual ticket, and you get a screening link. So it's basically like a streamer, but you're supporting the movie theater. And in essence, we are getting a quote unquote theatrical release.
Okay.
So in normal times, in speaking with our distributor, we would have had a traditional release in 200 screens across the country. And I know our distributor in Japan who picked us up is a theatrical distributor. In Portugal is a theatrical distributor. So I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what it would have been.
But how do you get to a streaming platform like an Amazon Prime or Apple, and how does that work generally?
Those are all deals procured from our distributor. So Greenwich took all the rights for North America, including theatrical, and then parlayed these deals for us. And I'll tell you a quick story about a friend of mine, Geeta Patel. It's like my Big Fat Greek Weddings. She made a film a few years ago called Meet the Patels. It was about her family. She grew up in North Carolina as an Indian American, and she and her brother decided to make a documentary about understanding Indian American culture. And the things that her mom would say to her and her American friends would be like, oh my God, Geeta, I can't believe your mom is so abusive. Your mom says, oh, Geeta, you've gained weight. That's unthinkable for
correct.
A white parent. They're like,
every immigrant will be thinking, what's the big deal about that right now?
You hear that all the time.
That's par for the course. I mean, some families might say there's a slipper which is being hurled at you as well. But anyway.
Yeah, but it's something. Oh, you're too skinny. You're too fat. There's always something, right? And then her friends in North Carolina were like, oh my God, your mom is so abusive. And she says, you don't understand. You don't get it. My mom loves me. This is it. So she and her brother set out to do this documentary. And it was funny, after talking to her, she said they didn't make any of the major festivals in the US, like South by Southwest, Sundance. But her parents ended up being so proud of her. They made lawn signs. They did a whole little grassroots campaign among the Indian community. And it became this huge sleeper hit. It just went viral, so to speak.
Sleeper hit as in within the Indian community, or did it do, I've seen, the movie rings a bell, but I can't place it, but did it become like a global hit?
It definitely in the Indian community, and so much so that studios came knocking on Geeta's door, and they were like, this is incredible. Can we turn it into a sitcom? So then the documentary became a sitcom called Meet the Patels.
Got it.
So it was really, you just never know what can happen, the kind of magic from a theatrical release.
Correct. talking about immigrants and immigrant families, and tell me a little bit about your growing up and a little bit about your family and how did you get into the movies?
Okay, I grew up, born and raised in Los Angeles, Chinese American family, middle class being very comfortable, wanted for nothing, had lots of friends. Everything was very ordinary. Friends were doing Girl Scouts and all of the stereotypes are true of my expectations to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. Go to one of the Ivy League schools that were acceptable, work very hard. And my brother and I feel like I was always a little bit of a black sheep. I feel like I was smart, but I didn't really love algorithms. I didn't really love standardized testing. I didn't really love putting my nose studying equations, for hours on end. And I really I gravitated towards the arts at a very early age. In fact, it was my dad who bought me my first SLR camera, taught me the rule of thirds and composition and Ansel Adams. But I'll just say, generally speaking, like Asian parents, like, oh, this is great. It's great for you to have an interest in the arts.
It's a hobby.
A hobby. But no way can you pursue this as a career.
Correct.
And I did end up pursuing it as a career. And my first job out of school, I had no nepotism, obviously. I knew nobody in the business. I had to go. It was like the back of Variety magazine or a Hollywood Reporter and finding unpaid internships and finding a way that I could get my way into my first movie set. And my first job out of school was a receptionist answering phones at an edit house. To my mom's dismay, she's like, you have a college degree and you're answering phones and making coffee for people? This was just completely unthinkable for her immigrant daughter. But these things that we kind of butted heads, like, Mom, you don't get it. This is how I meet people. And like, this is how you have to pay your dues. And that is something that is for immigrant parent culture, is like, you work really hard and you go to an Ivy League school and you already graduate making six figures. You're never making coffee for anybody. There's no such thing as working for free. So all of this kind of butting heads, and I was younger, of course, that was 21 when I graduated from college, and kind of butting heads with her and being frustrated that she didn't understand these life decisions that I was making. And actually, in making The Donut King, it gave me a better understanding about where I came from and the immigrant experience. I was like, well, of course, if my mom came from that, she doesn't want me. They didn't escape communism, come to America and work their butts off in their head for me to answer phones and make coffee for other people.
Yeah. There was a part in the movie where the relative of Ted who talks about, I'll do anything. For him, washing washrooms was a step up. He's coming from a life and death situation to a place where he's making the same amount what any other person would make per hour, and no job was not cliche at all. The smallest of the smallest jobs for him was heaven. And I think a lot of immigrants who came from that time came from very tough backgrounds. So I think a lot of them worked so hard just so that they gave you an education. And once you got an education, it was their way that, okay, kind of like now you're paying them back, so to speak. Not necessarily financially, but okay, we worked hard, but now you have so-called made it. And for an immigrant kid to say, I'm going in the arts, when were you the receptionist? Which year would that be?
Early 2000s.
Okay. So what happened then? How did you get your first break, so to speak, in the movie business?
Oh, it took a little bit. I feel like going into the movie business, it takes a little bit of, I talk to other filmmakers now, that a little bit of this delusion of grandeur. You have to have this confidence and belief in yourself, which comes from, actually for me, strangely, it came from my parents, particularly my dad, who always told me, although arts is a hobby, but he did tell me, he said, you are so smart, you can do anything you set out to do. Whatever you do, you're going to do really well at it. And I thank the heavens for those words, because that went into my biological algorithms, that came into my exactly how I viewed the world, and I was like, oh, I can do of course I can do this. And I went into it with that naivete. And now looking back at that girl who answered phones and went into this world with this confidence or delusion of grandeur, I didn't see myself then as a woman or a person of color. I had no idea that those cards were stacked against me. And I never ever wanted to, I never played that victim role or believed in that. But now looking in hindsight, there are just some realities. And it's true. You do have some cards stacked against you as a person of color and as a woman. But I went into the world ready to accomplish anything and everything and thinking that I could. And so I don't know, I guess I made some kind of ballsy phone calls and I said, hey, I'm Alice Gu. What do you got for me? Will you hire me? I'm ready to work. Not in those words, but that was basically the attitude. And maybe that, I remember a couple of people, it took them a little off guard and they're like, yeah, okay. Yeah, can you start on Wednesday?
I think it's just so off the beaten path that what you did was, for somebody as well, I don't know who took you up on or gave you that break, but I don't think they would have probably got a call similar to it. So even for them, it must have been a surprise. And I think the novelty of it as well. And for you, as you said, you didn't know any better. And you had this attitude that why not? I suppose at that time you had nothing to lose anyways. And how far along was it where you can say this was your first big break, whatever that means? How many years into the business would that be? Because at some time, mom would still be telling you to get a real job.
My mom still tells me to get a real job. So I'll tell you a funny anecdote. And this isn't like big head or anything, but just for context, in this past year, because of this film, I've had the good fortune of being written up in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, LA Times, New York Times, so some prestigious publications of note in the US. And my mom is like, but are you going to get a real job at some point?
No, she did that. Oh my God.
And I joke to other friends and like, you haven't made it until you're in the Chinese language paper.
Okay. Got it.
It's like you have to be picked up in the Chinese language paper. In fact, a friend of hers went to her the other day when I was in the LA Times, and she said, Judy, you're never going to believe this. This girl in this article has the same name as your daughter.
Oh.
I'm like, that is my daughter. And my mom, she might be proud of me now. We'll see. I went on a Mandarin language radio show a few weeks ago. It's on AM radio in Los Angeles. It's the longest running Mandarin language show in California. And her friend heard me. So she said, Judy, I heard your daughter on the radio.
Yeah.
So anyway, the words "I'm proud of you" has not really come out of her mouth, but maybe.
Has she seen the movie?
You know what? Can you believe it? She hasn't seen the movie. She doesn't know how to use tech.
Okay, somebody has to figure that out for her. One thing which stuck with me was how the story was told, and how you also mentioned in other podcasts or other interviews that the donut was the hook. But there were some layers of the movie which were quite, they were real, but they were dark. And I loved the editing. It really stood out. It was the highlight of the movie for me. Was, apart from everything, the editing was just top class.
Thank you for noticing. I feel the same way. My editor, Carol Martori, we really pushed it in a way that we wanted to do something a bit different and not just linear storytelling. Let's see how we can do this in a way that keeps the audience engaged and interested.
Correct.
And
so Alice, for somebody who hasn't seen The Donut King, how would you best describe the story of Donut King?
The Donut King is the story of a man, a Cambodian refugee by the name of Ted Ngoy, who escaped genocide and war in 1975 Cambodia. This is the era of the Khmer Rouge, of Pol Pot dictatorial regime, he escaped. And it was the one and only time in US history where an American president issued an executive order to receive refugees. And that was President Gerald Ford. Ted Ngoy arrived in Camp Pendleton 1975, penniless, not knowing anything about the culture, language, no friends, and had to set up a whole new life for himself, and worked 3 jobs around the clock: janitor, gas station attendant, building supply store clerk, and built an unlikely empire of donut shops, independent donut shops. And within 3 years of arriving in the US, he was a millionaire. And the second wave of refugees came, and he sponsored hundreds of other Cambodians, giving them visas, training them in the donut business, giving them a shot at the American dream, and giving them a chance in their adopted homeland. And it's the rise and fall and rise again of this man and the legacy he left behind.
And he lost all his donut shops, and he eventually returned to Cambodia. So to weave all of that into the movie, and also for him to have come back and visit some of the shops now towards the end, I thought that was a great touch as well. So to integrate all of that with the donut being the hook, especially for the American audience, I thought that was brilliant.
Thank you. Well, we go into some pretty dark territory. Over 2 million people were killed during that time in Cambodia. That was a third of the country's population. I mean, it was just massive. It was just a massive tragedy at that time. And it was child labor, it was starvation, it was bombs, it was seeing family members, neighbors, ruthless killing. I mean, it's shown in the killing fields. And we knew, oh gosh, times are hard enough in reality for a lot of us. We want to see something that's not even more depressing than real life. But we knew that we had this magic, this hook of the donut, which also played into a bit of the editing style. We're like, well, we know we want to get into the context of why it was so incredible that this man created it. Like, talk about the cards being stacked against him. What were the stakes? What did he escape? What were the challenges? And we had to set that all up. And of course, that had to go into the history of the political climate at that time.
Correct.
And like, okay, if we go too deep into genocide, are we going to lose people? This is But
it was a delicate, and that's why I thought it was brilliantly shown, because it was so relevant. You cannot talk about, why there was a reason why 90% of all the donut shops were owned by Cambodians at that given time, and I think it's about 80% today. There's a reason for Ted Ngoy was the first one, and he worked for an American who was at that time the biggest player in town. And as you said, how he sponsored all the families, but the backdrop to that was a horrific. It was a genocide under Pol Pot, which also surprisingly a lot of people are not aware of, and maybe some Cambodian second, third generation as well. Maybe the parents, and you briefly mentioned this in the movie, that the parents also hid this facet of it just because it was so horrific for them.
It is, I feel like a lot of, I won't even say Asian people in particular, and maybe just people in general, if you're escaping that and you've come to this new world, you don't want to talk about that anymore. You're only looking forward.
Correct.
And so a lot of the kids, they don't even know their history. They're like, you know what? My parents don't really talk about it. I think it's hard for them to talk about it. And I'm curious, but then I feel bad because I don't want them to feel sad and thinking about the past. But I also feel like it's so important. If you have to have an idea of where you come from.
Right.
And unless we talk about it or these stories are told, it's going to be lost forever. Right. And I ask a lot of the younger generation, of course we did the research, but I wanted it in their own words. I said, well, who's Pol Pot and who is the Khmer Rouge? Oh, he was a bad guy, really, really bad guy. Like, yeah, but why? And who? And who was the Khmer Rouge? oh, the Khmer Rouge, they were really bad people. I'm like, but why? So a lot don't even have a more in-depth understanding. And Chris, known as Orcombe, who was Ted's youngest son featured in the film, he didn't even know how his parents met until he read it in the LA Times
Wow.
years later. And the
Wow.
parents are so busy working that they're not really having story time around the dinner
Yeah.
table or a chance to tell these stories. He finds out so much in every article, and all of the kids in making this film, because this film, I was like, you're going to have to dig deep, go in your attic, find all the pictures, ask all the questions, talk to distant relatives. You're going to have to hook me up. And they said, wow, this was really like, I really found out so much more about my family. And the grandkids had reached out and they said, thank you for making this movie about my grandpa. I understand so much more now where I come from.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, that is just so meaningful to me as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of instances as well where he goes to the donut shops, and you can see how the youngsters identify with him because they've heard of Uncle Ted. Some of them have never seen him, have never met him, and he also slightly disenfranchised some of the people through his gambling situation.
Yeah, and I also want to add, though this story takes place in America and is very much about the American dream, I've had people from London, from different backgrounds, a Pakistani girl say, I know of the American dream through movies and story, and things that I see. So though my parents are not American and I'm not Cambodian and I'm Pakistani and I grew up British, this is still completely familiar to me.
Yeah.
This is still about the immigrant experience. And this is still about immigrant kids growing up, whether that's in Australia or London or Canada or wherever it may be, learning about what your parents went through and what sacrifices they made, for me, us, you, to have the life that the choices that we have.
I think that also created a lot of friction. I know in almost all the households, just because the expectations from where they've come and how they were raised when they were teenagers or how they were young adults, they didn't know a life any different than work. Whereas when you come into the American or Canadian way of life, I mean, you have everything from sports, extracurricular activities, soccer games, concerts. But I think in the story, what we saw was the first generation who came, they were so hungry to build a life for themselves, and they did remarkably well. I read that what was the time where 90% of the donut shops in LA or in California were owned by Cambodia? Was it 1980?
That would be in the 80s and 90s.
80s and 90s.
They kept growing, said like wildfire. There's just shops opening all the time.
And how many donuts does an average American eat in a year?
Oh
30,
gosh,
31. I'm not doing a spot quiz. I promise I'm not doing a spot quiz. I read it. So they say that an average American eats 31 donuts a year. So
about 3 donuts a month. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good business. It's as American as it gets.
It's as American as it gets. And that was actually one of, the genesis of making this film is that, and I spoke with a food historian, the most American foods, you think of hamburgers, Coca-Cola, and donuts.
Correct.
And I found it ironic that one of the most American foods west of the Mississippi, chances are if you got it from an independent donut shop, a Cambodian was making your most American food.
It's funny where you mentioned that because your movie probably would not have been made, or who is to say, if your nanny did not use the word Cambodian donut. Can you talk about that story?
Yes. So the genesis again, I was a new mother at the time, and my husband had gone to, we're in the west side of Los Angeles, had gone to this upscale bakery and brought home gourmet donuts and pastries. And we offered one to the nanny and she said, oh no, thank you. I only eat Cambodian donuts. We're like, what is a Cambodian donut? We're like, eat one of these. These are like the $6 each
The gourmet.
gourmet donuts.
Mm.
And she says, no, I only eat Cambodian donuts. And the next day she said, oh, I found a Cambodian donut shop. And me being Asian, and I say, and a foodie, and I feel like I've tried, or I've at least attempted to try, a bunch of different flavors. I was like, what is a Cambodian? How come I've never heard of a Cambodian donut? No one's ever mentioned it to me. What does it taste like? And
in your mind, you were expecting something different and not the traditional American donut. You were thinking it's different flavors, correct?
Different flavor completely, maybe spiced with like a little cardamom or even a different shape.
Correct.
What we call a Chinese donut is like a breakfast, like long cruller. And the next day she says, oh, I found a Cambodian donut. I brought you Cambodian donuts. We're like, all right, this has been a couple of days of suspense now. I'm ready to try this Cambodian donut. The anticipation is killing me. And my husband and I, we open the bag and it's round with a hole in the middle, shiny. And we're like, okay. We take a bite.
Looks pretty much the same.
And we're like, come on. We're like, this is a glazed donut. This is an American donut. And she says, no, this is a Cambodian donut. We're like, how on earth is this a Cambodian donut? This is an American donut. And this goes back and forth. And for me, the conversation is getting a little absurd. She says, Cambodian people make it. I said, if Cambodian people make it, it's still an American donut. And she says, no, it's a Cambodian donut. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I decide to Google Cambodian donuts, Los Angeles, kind of to prove her wrong. I was like, this is an American donut. But no, she was right. Cambodian donuts are a thing. Cambodians make your donuts. And all the articles came up. This is why you have a pink box. This is why there are no Dunkin' Donuts in California. The rags to riches story of the refugee turned millionaire. And I couldn't believe, as a lifelong born and bred Angelina who has seen donut shops in every corner and has been familiar with seeing Asian people behind the counter, I never questioned what kind of Asian person or why they were there. And
makes sense. It makes sense now.
It just blew my mind.
I want to know how much of the movie royalties is your nanny demanding?
I think she gets free donuts for life from me.
That's a good trade-off. Free Cambodian donuts.
Free Cambodian donuts for life.
Yeah, I think that's a fair trade-off. And you met Ted in Cambodia. I also need to mention this, the romance aspect of it. Let's talk a little bit about that, because Ted belonged to what one would call a slightly lower section of the society, and his wife. How would you best describe that courtship for him? Because it was quite ballsy.
It was quite ballsy, and it was important to tell because it would let the viewers glean some information about his propensity for taking risks and his character. So Ted was born dirt poor. I mean, dirt poor, without enough food to eat for his family. His mother was a smuggler. She smuggled goods back and forth from the Thai border, and she had no education, and barefoot, dirt floors, chickens and snakes. That was their life. And back to the immigrant thing, his mom said, oh, and kind of in a double layer here, his mom was a Chinese immigrant to
Correct.
Cambodia.
Wow.
So,
that's super hard. And he would have grown up knowing that, and that would have been so hard on his mom and him as well.
Yeah. So she was a Chinese immigrant who, they were a bit of a despised, they were an underclass there. So in the immigrant way, she said, our only way out of this is education. So I'm going to work every day. I won't eat enough food to fill my belly so that I can set some aside and I can send you to the best school that I can and get you out of here. And that's what she did. So she sent him to these schools and sent him to school outside of the village and going to these bigger towns. And these were the kinds of sacrifices made by the immigrant parents at the time. It's the sacrifice, like, I love you, but I'm going to send you away to boarding school so that you can have a better life. And one of those schools now brought him to Phnom Penh, the capital. And he admittedly said he was scared. So many cars and so many people, sophisticated people, like it's completely different from countryside life. And he says that he fell in love. It was Dave School. It was the girl who smelled like flowers. And she was the most beautiful girl in all of the class. And he also discovered that she came from a very high ranking family. And at this time in Asia, if you were from a different class, from the lower class, I mean, your life is basically worthless. And if somebody from an upper class decides they want to kill you, there are really no consequences for them. And your life is no loss for society. And that's just how it was. But he fell in love with this girl, Sugantini, and he decided, he's like, I have to go after her. And, I actually find out later, so I know it's high-ranking family, but, I didn't know how much of that was for dramatic effect. But later, talking to Sugantini, now Christy, and her family, her sister, for a time, was the first lady of Cambodia. That's how high-ranking, the most high-ranking as you can get.
Wow, and that's not revealed in the movie, by the way. So that's
not. I found that out later.
Okay.
I found that
she came
out
from money, and wow, Ted really swung for the fences.
He really, talk about like as poor as you can get, going for the top, as high as you can get.
Yeah.
And he had the guts to do it. He started blowing up. He had a way of playing the flute and attracted her, started passing notes.
There was no WhatsApp or sliding in DMs at that time.
This was analog. This was old school, passing notes to the maid and trying to get her attention. And he said one day, he said, the notes started getting a bit more flirtatious. And he said, well, what if one day I decided to jump into your villa? And she says, oh, haha, what if you end up in my parents' room, my mother's room? They'll kill you. And he said one day he just took that risk. He climbed up a tree, past the guards, past the Belgian Malinois dog, and jumped into her bedroom and stayed under her bed for 45 days.
This might need another podcast because I want to ask how he managed to do that. So where can somebody watch The Donut King?
You can watch The Donut King on Amazon Prime Video, iTunes, Google Play, YouTube. Different countries in the world can find us on Vice. Okay. And I'll add one real quick thing if I have a couple minutes.
You absolutely have. Please.
This did not make it into the film, but about Ted, and again, his risk-taking. He loved Christy so much, and her dad said, I will kill you. And Ted's mom went and begged to the father and said, please don't kill my son. We'll do anything. And he says, okay, all right, I'll spare his life, but he has to denounce his love for Christy in public in our home. So we want him to come and say, I never loved you. I'm a bad guy. I'm a dog. I have like 20 other girlfriends. You were never serious to me. And to know that he said this, we're going to hide behind a curtain in the living room, and then he can be free. So Ted went prepared, and he had to go to the living room. Christy, her name was Sugantini at the time, she came out, and he said, Sugantini, I never loved you. I'm a terrible person. I have 20 girlfriends. And he was saying this, he saw her heart break before his very eyes. And he said he couldn't take it. And he armed himself with a dagger. And he said, Christy, this is not true. Your parents made me say this. I love you. I will love you forever. I would never hurt you. He takes out the dagger and he stabs himself 3 times. I'd rather kill myself than hurt you. And he stabbed himself 3 times, started bleeding out in the living room. And then, so he got dragged away, and Sugantini, Christy, she was so distraught by this. She took a bunch of pills and tried to kill herself. Ted ended up healing in the hospital, climbed into her room and said, no, don't die. And it was at this point that her parents said, oh my God, you guys, okay, go be together, but you guys you cannot be in the city anymore. You've disgraced the family. And I thought this might all be a wild story, but when I met him, he lifted his shirt. He still has the 3 puncture wounds deep puncture wounds in his torso.
Thank you for sharing that. And now I understand why she wouldn't leave him at all, despite what he was doing, hurting the family, hurting the community. And I mean, you needed to really have more than just love. And I think this context, and now I understand he was prepared to die. Listen, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've absolutely loved the movie, and thank you for making time, Alice.
Thank you, Rohan. Thank you so much for having me.